We are very fortunate that Professor McMurray is able to come again here and give us a talk of updates on paradigm heart failure and all the sub-studies that have been done after its official publication back in 2014. So we hope that this interaction is more of an open exchange of ideas. So feel free to come forward and ask your questions, and let's take this opportunity to clear all our doubts, all our still hanging questions about paradigm and about sacubital valsalva. So again, dear doctors, Professor John.
Thank you very much. Antonio told me that I'm standing between you and a party, so I'm slightly worried now. So what I thought I would do is give you a very quick summary of what are my favourite secondary publications from paradigm heart failure, but I'm very happy to answer any questions that my selection doesn't answer that you might have. So let's see if we can get this to work. Yep. So these, of course, are the main publications from paradigm heart failure. And just to remind you, I showed this slide earlier today, but if you weren't here, to remind you what the paradigm heart failure trial was about. It was about testing whether or not inhibiting this enzyme neprilysin, if you do that in addition to all the other good things that we do for patients with heart failure and reduced ejection fraction, whether that will improve things further. And again, as I said at lunchtime, the whole point of neprilysin inhibition is to inhibit the breakdown of vasoactive substances that hopefully are beneficial in patients with heart failure, for example, the natriuretic peptides. This was the actual trial. I'm not going to go through the results of this in detail because you know the results, but what I'll do is I'll show you all the additional analyses that we've been able to do because we've got such a large and rich database. As you can see here, these were patients who were getting the best standard of care. They had to be on a beta blocker. Everybody was obviously getting an inhibitor of the renin-angiotensin system. Most patients were also getting a mineralocorticoid receptor antagonist. Patients had to have a slightly elevated natriuretic peptide level to get enrolled in the trial. That was not because of the way the drug works, but to ensure that these patients were at relatively high risk of events. You can see that the median follow-up was 27 months. Patients were followed for up to 5 years, and we had over 8,400 patients enrolled. That's the primary composite endpoint, cardiovascular death or heart failure hospitalization. But again, as I showed at lunchtime, since we published the main trial, there's been an awful lot written about sacubitril valsartan and paradigm heart failure. And we've published, I think it's now 26 secondary papers from paradigm heart failure, and I will pick out some of my favourites from that list. So one of my favourites was a paper we published pretty early after the primary results, and that was looking at the mode of death, the effect of sacubitril valsartan on the two principal ways in which patients with heart failure die. As you know, patients with heart failure generally die either from worsening heart failure, progressive pump failure, or they die suddenly, and we assume sudden death in most cases is electrical death, is arrhythmic death. And as you can see, sacubitril valsartan compared to enalapril reduced both of these two major modes of death, reduced both of them significantly. And I think the thing that most people have been intrigued by is the sudden death story, because as you can see, the effect in sudden death was very rapid in onset. If you look at those Kaplan-Meier curves for sudden death, you can see that they separate very quickly. And I suppose it's also worth reminding everybody that because patients in paradigm heart failure had mainly mild symptoms, the major mode of death was sudden death, not death from progressive pump failure. And that effect on the two major modes of cardiovascular death also translated into a reduction that was statistically significant in overall mortality as well. So reduction in the two principal ways in which patients with heart failure die, leading to a reduction in all-cause mortality as well. Another one of my favourite secondary publications, and remember I'm just picking out some of these, was looking at the effect of sacubitril valsartan compared to enalapril according to age. And I like this because it's very important clinically, and I also like it because this is a very nice type of analysis. So these figures show you the effect of sacubitril valsartan compared to enalapril, the hazard ratio for sacubitril valsartan compared to enalapril is shown by the blue line. The black horizontal line is unity, so if the hazard ratio is below 1, that means sacubitril valsartan is beneficial compared to enalapril. And age is shown here as a continuous measurement. Now, there are several things to point out on this slide. The first is the oldest patient randomized was 96 years of age. The grey shaded areas, these are the 95% confidence intervals around the hazard ratio. So you can see that these are quite wide at very young age. We didn't have many patients below the age of 25. And they're also quite wide in patients who are very elderly, because again, we didn't have many patients over the age of 90. But what you can see, and particularly for heart failure hospitalization, is that that sacubitril valsartan to enalapril hazard ratio is below 1 right across the spectrum of age. In other words, this figure is telling you that sacubitril valsartan was better than enalapril right across the very broad spectrum of age that we had in the trial. That was certainly true for heart failure hospitalization. You might say that maybe there's a loss of mortality benefit in extremely elderly patients, but that's probably not so surprising because nobody's claiming that sacubitril valsartan makes you immortal, but it certainly reduces your risk of heart failure hospitalization even when you're very elderly. Another important paper that we published was one looking at risk, looking at baseline risk. So an awful lot of people said, oh, we only studied low-risk patients because the majority of patients were in NYHA class 2, had mild symptoms. But that's a mistake because, of course, mild symptoms is not the same thing as having a mild disease. Mild symptoms is not the same thing as being at low risk. And risk in heart failure is a multi-variable construct. In other words, there are many, many variables that go into determining a patient's risk. And this is a risk calculator that we published, and this is available online. We did this quite a few years ago, but I still think it's one of the best risk calculators for two reasons. One is that we developed this risk calculator in a very large data set with nearly 40,000 patients. And secondly, most of the variables that go into this risk calculator are ones that you collect quite routinely in your clinical practice. And you can, if you use these variables and you put them into that risk calculator, you can get a risk score for your patient. And here you see the distribution of risk scores in the in the Paradigm Heart Failure trial. So you can see here that some people had a very low score, and the range was from 4 to the highest score was 40. The maximum score with the magic risk calculator is up to 57. So we had a whole spectrum of risk according to this score, in the Paradigm heart failure trial. So even though most of these patients were NYHA class 2, a lot of them were actually at quite high risk. So here's all-cause mortality, and what I've done in this slide is I've divided the patients in Paradigm heart failure into 5 equal groups according to their magic risk score. So these patients over here, they're in the top 1/5, the top 20% of risk scores. And you can see that in the enalapril group, that's the black bar, these patients had an annual mortality of between 15 and 16%. So there were very many high-risk patients in the Paradigm heart failure trial. It wasn't just low-risk patients. And most importantly, whether you were low risk or whether you were high risk, you still got a benefit from sacubitril valsartan. You can see that the benefit of sacubitril valsartan, LCZ696, compared to enalapril was similar right across the spectrum of risk. So another analysis that we published is one that addresses a question that we've been asked quite a lot about the Paradigm heart failure trial, and that is to do with ejection fraction. So during the trial, we changed the entry ejection fraction from 40% or above to 35% or above. And lots of people said, why did you do that? Why did you lower the entry ejection fraction? Well, the reason we did that was during the course of the Paradigm heart failure trial, we also published another study called Emphasis Heart Failure, showing that mineralocorticoid receptor antagonists were beneficial even in patients with mild symptoms. We knew that doctors were going to use MRAs more commonly in patients in Paradigm, and they did do that, and we realized that that would reduce the risk of events. And to ensure that we continue to have a high event rate so that we could test our hypothesis, we reduced the ejection fraction so that patients were generally at higher risk. But the important point is that whatever ejection fraction you look at, the benefit of sacubitril valsartan was the same. So these 3 left ventricular ejection fraction categories here are the equal thirds. These are the patients divided into 3 equal groups according to their ejection fraction. So about a third of patients had an LVEF less than 28%, a third of patients had an ejection fraction above 33%. Whatever ejection fraction people had, they had the same benefit from sacubitril valsartan. In fact, we had a lot of patients with an ejection fraction between 35 and 40%. So we think that sacubitril valsartan is effective right across the ejection fraction spectrum up to 40%. Another important paper that we published was, I think, critically important for future heart failure trials because it's already changed the way that we're doing new studies. And that was a paper looking at not just the things that we normally look at, like heart failure hospitalization, but looking at the prognostic consequences of other manifestations of worsening. So if you look at this bar, this shows you the mortality in patients who were admitted to hospital with worsening heart failure during follow-up in Paradigm heart failure. And you can see it was very high. And if you look at the far side of the slide, over there are patients who had no evidence of worsening of heart failure during follow-up. They had a 14% mortality. These patients had a 37% mortality. But the 2 interesting groups are the 2 bars in the middle, and in particular, the second bar from the left of the slide as you look at it, because that second bar shows you patients who had an increase in their heart failure treatment during follow-up. So that meant they either had a new heart failure drug added, so that might be digoxin, or it might have been an MRA, or those patients had an increase in diuretic dose, or they received intravenous treatment at some point during follow-up. And you can see that those patients had almost as high a mortality as patients who were admitted to hospital. And this group are patients who attended an emergency department but were sent home without being admitted to hospital. And what this analysis has told us is that, first of all, many patients who don't get admitted to hospital do have evidence of worsening, requires a change in treatment, and just the very act of you or I having to change treatment, having to intensify medical therapy, that identifies a patient at high risk of subsequent events, high risk of subsequent mortality. So it seems what we've learned from this is that it's the fact that somebody's symptoms are getting worse that is really important and identifies that as a patient who's going to do badly. It's not where they're treated, it's the fact that they need intensification of treatment because they've got worsening symptoms. And if you put all of these things together, so if you now create an expanded composite endpoint, not just of cardiovascular death or heart failure hospitalization, but also of emergency department visits or the need for intensification of treatment, you can see that that results in an event rate of about 11% per year. So again, even though these were very well treated patients with predominantly mild symptoms, a lot of them were exhibiting some manifestation of worsening over time. And in a lot of the new trials that I spoke about earlier today, if you were at my presentation, a lot of the new trials are now using this endpoint to assess treatment rather than just cardiovascular death or heart failure hospitalization. And that's just showing you that sacubitril valsartan reduced all of these different manifestations of worsening compared to enalapril, whether that's heart failure hospitalization, whether it's intensification of outpatient treatment, whether it's an emergency department visit, all of those things were reduced by sacubitril valsartan compared to enalapril. One of the most common questions that we get when we speak about sacubitril valsartan and paradigm heart failure in different parts of the world is about whether or not things were different in different regions of the world. And we published this paper in the European Heart Journal. Now these are the baseline characteristics, and what many people in America and Europe ask about paradigm heart failure is why were the patients so young? So the average age of about 63 is at least 10 years younger than the average age of patients where I work. And of course that's because, or one of the reasons behind that, is that we recruited in over 40 countries worldwide. And of course the age of patients with heart failure differs greatly in different parts of the world. And in this part of the world, the average age was much younger than in patients where I work. And again, you can see interesting differences really in almost everything that you look at. Our friends, for example, in North America are much more likely to have carried out revascularization in the patients with heart failure than in other regions of the world. And again, if you look at things like atrial fibrillation, much less common in the Asia-Pacific region than in other parts of the world, although even within this part of the world there's variation between countries. Atrial fibrillation is quite common in Japan, but is very uncommon in India. So even in the Asia-Pacific region it's a bit different. You can see that the prevalence of diabetes varies enormously as well, even between North and South America. And then maybe the most interesting thing of all is variation in use of treatment. So if you take something like mineralocorticoid receptor antagonists, They're still not used very widely in the United States, but they're used very widely indeed in South America. But in the US, ICDs and CRT are very widely used, devices are implanted. There's North America is Canada, and the US, if you just look at the US, that figure 60%, but in other parts of the world, devices are much less commonly used. So there's enormous variation in patient characteristics, enormous variation in background therapy, and there's enormous variation in mortality rates and hospitalization rates. These are mortality rates, so this is a rate per 100 patient years of follow-up. So you can compare these across regions, and this region has the second highest mortality rate of any region in the world. Though again, there are great differences between countries. Japan has the lowest mortality rate of anywhere in the world. Here's hospitalization rates, quite high hospitalization rates as well in this part of the world. But the interesting thing is, if you look across the regions, there was no difference in the effect of treatment according to geographic regions. So all of these point estimates line up, and the interaction, the p-value for interaction down here is non-significant. That tells you that geographic region did not modify the benefit of sacubitril valsartan over enalapril. So a related sort of study is one that looks at the effect of sacubitril valsartan according to background treatment. This was published by a Japanese fellow of mine in Circulation Heart Failure, and because we were asked this question so often, we decided to do the analysis. So on this slide and the next slide, you see a hazard ratio for sacubitril valsartan compared to enalapril in patients on different background treatments or with different histories of types of intervention. So if you look at diuretics, for example, you can see that most people on diuretics, some weren't. And you can see that in both patients on diuretics and not on diuretics at baseline, there is a benefit of sacubitril valsartan compared to enalapril. The interaction p-value for all of these was not significant. Digoxin, mineralocorticoid receptor antagonists, defibrillating devices. A lot of American doctors are very interested in whether or not sacubitril valsartan worked in people with an ICD. The answer is yes, it did. And a lot of American doctors think that the rest of the world doesn't do enough coronary artery bypass surgery, enough angioplasty, and asked us whether or not sacubitril valsartan works in patients who've had previous coronary revascularization. The answer is yes, it does. We didn't have enough patients to do a proper subgroup analysis of not being on a beta blocker. If you remember, everybody had to be in a beta blocker unless it was contraindicated, or they didn't tolerate a beta blocker, so we only had 588 people not on the beta blocker. But we also, instead, we looked at whether or not people were on a high dose versus a low dose of beta blocker. And again, whatever way you look at it, you can see that patients who got sacubitril valsartan did better than patients who got enalapril. And then one of the most recent papers we published, I think, is one of the most interesting, and that is looking at the effect of sacubitril valsartan according to baseline NT-proBNP level. And I'll show you this in two different ways. This is a categorical analysis. So here you can see all the patients in paradigm heart failure divided into 4 equal groups according to baseline NT-proBNP. And this point estimate shows you the overall point estimate, and these point estimates show you the effect in patients with a low, medium, high NT-proBNP level, and again there was a consistent benefit. But a more interesting way maybe to show you this is as I illustrate it for age. So this green line shows you a continuous hazard ratio for sacubitril valsartan compared to enalapril. If the hazard ratio is below 1, that indicates benefit of sacubitril valsartan compared to enalapril. And you can see that the hazard ratio was consistently below 1 right across the spectrum of NT-proBNP. So I cut this off at 10,000 because we didn't have too many people above 10,000. We had people down to 400. In fact, we had a few below 400. And you can see that the benefit of sacubitril valsartan was clearly there right across the spectrum of NT-proBNP. Certainly no suggestion that sacubitril valsartan was less effective in patients with low NT-proBNP. If anything, the hazard ratio was more favourable. And that's relevant because in some countries the authorities have required patients to have an elevated NT-proBNP to be eligible for sacubitril valsartan, but that doesn't make any sense. It's really hard to believe that the treatment effect magically disappears below an NT-proBNP of 400. Another question people have asked about is, do you need to get to the full dose? Have you to be on the full dose of sacubitril valsartan to get its benefits? And again, we tried to look at this. Now, Paradigm Heart Failure was a pretty unique study in its design, in that everybody started on the full dose of sacubitril valsartan or the full dose of enalapril, but over up to 5 years of follow-up, clearly some people had to reduce the dose of treatment or stop treatment altogether. And of course, if that happened, neither the doctor nor the patient knew what treatment they were getting during the study. It was only at the end of the trial that we unblinded treatment allocation. So these figures show you what happened in patients who had a dose reduction. Now, the first thing to say is that whether you were in the enalapril group or the sacubitril valsartan group, if you had a reduction in dose of study drug during the trial, you did worse. Now, we've known that from other trials, and it probably tells you two things. It tells you that if you need to reduce the dose of any drug, probably means you're a sicker patient. You've maybe got lower blood pressure, you've maybe got worse renal function, you're probably sicker, and that's one of the reasons why you do worse. And then the other reason is, for most drugs that we use in heart failure, there's evidence that bigger doses are better. So the combination of being sicker and also having to get a lower dose means that you do worse. So any patient, no matter what randomized treatment they got, if they had to reduce their dose, they did worse. But the interesting thing was that patients who reduced their dose of sacubitril valsartan still did better, still had a lower event rate than patients who reduced their dose of enalapril. So the benefit of sacubitril valsartan compared to enalapril was even apparent in patients who required a reduction in dose of study drug during follow-up. And this is, again, just a different way of showing it. You can see that right across the spectrum of doses here, you were better to be on sacubitril valsartan than to be on enalapril. And I think the second last one I'm going to show you is one related to blood pressure, because again, we get a lot of questions about blood pressure. If you remember, to be randomized into Paradigm Heart Failure, you had to have a systolic blood pressure of 95 millimeters of mercury or above. 95 millimeters of mercury or above. So we did a whole lot of analyses. These are recently published this year in the European Heart Journal. Michael Bohm from Germany, one of our steering committee, is the first author of this paper. And this slide simply shows you the effect of treatment according to baseline blood pressure. It shows you the effect for the primary endpoint, the composite of cardiovascular death or heart failure hospitalization, and it shows you the effect of treatment and cardiovascular mortality. And once again, what you see is that the point estimate is always less than 1. The point estimate always favours sacubitril valsartan over enalapril. Now, if you read this paper and if you read the supplement in the journal, there are many additional analyses, including analyses looking at blood pressure after randomization, because of course many patients had an even lower blood pressure after randomization. But one analysis I think is very intriguing, because I've never seen anything like it before, is one that we were requested to do by a reviewer of this manuscript. And what the reviewer asked us to do was to divide the patients into 4 groups. Patients who started with a low blood pressure, and by low that meant 100 millimeters of mercury or less, and remained low. Patients who had a higher blood pressure, so that's above 100, but their blood pressure fell below 100 during follow-up. Patients who started above 100 and remained above 100, that's the green line. And then lastly, patients who started at 100 or below and their blood pressure went up to above 100 during follow-up, that's the blue line. So over to the left of the slide, as you look at it, you can see the enalapril group. And that's exactly what we've seen in every other study. I've published a couple of examples of this, others have done the same. In every study, what you see is that patients who have a low blood pressure do worse than patients who've got a higher blood pressure. So the red line, patients who were low to start with and remained low. The orange line, people who were high and their blood pressure fell, they do worse. They have a higher event rate than patients with a higher blood pressure. But we did not see that pattern at all in the sacubitril valsartan group. Whether you had a low blood pressure during follow-up or whether you had a higher blood pressure during follow-up, your event rate was the same. In other words, blood pressure didn't seem to have the same prognostic significance if you were on sacubitril valsartan compared to enalapril. And then the last new publication I'm going to show you is one that I mentioned earlier on today, and that's looking at hemoglobin A1C in patients who have type 2 diabetes at baseline in paradigm heart failure. So the red line is the enalapril group, the blue line is the sacubitril valsartan group, and you can see that patients who got sacubitril valsartan had a significantly lower hemoglobin A1C during follow-up than patients who got enalapril, and this resulted in less frequent addition of insulin. So this figure shows you new prescription of insulin treatment in these patients with type 2 diabetes. So during follow-up, as you would expect, some patients who had diabetes at baseline needed insulin added to their current blood glucose lowering therapy to maintain glycemic control, but the likelihood of needing new insulin started was significantly less in the sacubitril valsartan group than in the enalapril group. So a very intriguing additional metabolic finding in paradigm heart failure, and it's intriguing because we know that being treated with insulin is a very bad prognostic sign in diabetes in general, and especially if you happen to have heart failure and diabetes. So I'll finish with telling you what's next. So the next paper we are about to submit is one looking at renal function, and if you remember, during paradigm heart failure we had pre-specified that we would look at 2 renal endpoints from a safety perspective. One was the proportion of patients developing a creatinine above 2.5 milligrams per deciliter or above. And the second safety endpoint was the proportion of patients developing a creatinine of 3 milligrams per deciliter or above. And interestingly, we saw significantly fewer people in the sacubitril valsartan group than in the enalapril group developing a high creatinine. And in fact, we saw significantly fewer people had to stop study drug because of renal dysfunction in the sacubitril valsartan group than in the enalapril group. Now, we also had pre-specified as one of our secondary endpoints a renal outcome, and here I think we made a mistake of trying to be a bit too clever. So we designed this composite endpoint with 3 components: a 50% decline in EGFR and reaching end-stage renal disease, so needing dialysis, needing renal transplantation. And these 2 bits are a standard renal endpoint in a chronic kidney disease trial. But because we thought these 2 events would be infrequent, we added this additional component in the middle, which hadn't really been used in any other trial. And overall, we saw no statistically significant benefit. But in fact, if we had just stuck with the traditional renal endpoint, if we just looked at these 2 components that would be used in a standard trial, there would have been a nominally statistically significant benefit in terms of renal outcomes. And in fact, if you look at the slope of decline in glomerular filtration rate over time, the black line is the enalapril group, so as you expect, over the course of 4 to 5 years follow-up, EGFR decreases in these patients with chronic heart failure. But if you look at the sacubitril valsartan group shown by the blue line, you can see that the rate of decline, the slope of decline in glomerular filtration rate was less than in the enalapril group. So some very interesting differences in renal function, favourable effects on renal function with sacubitril valsartan compared to enalapril. So this is my last slide, and it's just to point out that though I've talked to you a lot about all of these additional analyses from paradigm heart failure, there are also many other trials underway. Some of these are for regulatory purposes. For example, a study in children, that's Panorama, a study in Japan, those are regulatory studies. Some are investigator-driven studies that they're being done independently of the sponsor, Novartis. And then there are other studies that you can see here, some looking, for example, at the use of sacubitril valsartan in patients with recently decompensated heart failure, because a lot of doctors have questions about that. These are mainly about tolerability and titration. But we also have 2 big morbidity mortality trials. One I spoke about earlier today, Paragon heart failure in HFpEF, but there's also a very large morbidity mortality trial being done in patients with acute myocardial infarction. So lots more studies are underway. We'll see lots more information about this new drug emerging in the next few years from now. So I'll stop at that point, but I'm very happy to answer any questions that you might have that I've not addressed.
In the paradigm HF, you had inclusion criteria for ejection fraction. Were there any post-hoc analysis for all of echoes if the EF improved? And are there studies that look into things like diastolic dysfunction? As we know, elderly patients, as they age, the compliance of the heart muscle worsens, and you have normally high BNP levels. So, are there studies to look into those issues, if ever?
So, unfortunately, we did not do follow-up echoes in paradigm heart failure. We did not do an echo sub-study. I can tell you all the background to that, but it was essentially about how do you spend your money. Do you do it in recruiting more patients, or do you spend the money doing an echo sub-study? Just to let you know, an echo sub-study costs more than $1 million to do in a large clinical trial. And we made the decision that it was better to make Paradigm a bigger trial so that we would get a more robust estimate of the effect of treatment on morbidity and mortality. So I don't know the answer to that, but in the Paradise MI trial, there is an echo sub-study, and in the Paragon trial, the trial in heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, there is an echo sub-study. So everything you ever wanted to know about diastolic dysfunction will be measured in the Paragon, it is being measured in the Paragon heart failure trial. So the nearest I think we can get to your question maybe is that we do have a lot of biomarker data from paradigm heart failure, and as you probably know, we saw a reduction in NT-proBNP, so we think that reflects a reduction in wall stress. We saw a reduction in troponin, so we believe that reflects a reduction in cardiomyocyte death. We hope those things would translate into favourable remodelling, and we've presented but not yet published other biomarker data. So, for example, we saw favourable changes in MMPs, membrane matrix metalloproteases, and in ST2. So we've got some evidence of from other biomarkers that we've maybe had a favourable effect on left ventricular remodelling, but we did not measure, we didn't do serial echoes in paradigm heart failure.
Thank you for the lecture. I have two questions. What would be the mechanism for the non-significant change in the BP in the paradigm as compared to the enalaprilatone? And secondly, the intriguing effect of this particular drug on insulin. What was the explanation?
Okay. So what I'll do is I'll try and answer your BNP question first of all, and I hope I can do that by actually showing you some real data, which might help. I promise I don't use a map. Right, so you asked me about BNP. Oh, I thought you said BNP.
The enalaprilatone, there was a significant drop in BP, blood pressure. However, in the paradigm,
okay.
it was not significant.
Okay, so, sorry, I thought you asked me about BNP. So, why did those two figures differ? Well, one theory is that what sacubitril valsartan is doing is allowing the heart to operate in a low pressure circulation. So, in other words, obviously a failing ventricle finds it easier to eject blood against a low resistance. So you can think of blood pressure as a very crude measure, as you know, of afterload. And if you convert the circulation to a low pressure circulation, then the failing heart will perform better, and presumably patients will feel better and will survive longer. So that's one possibility. The hemoglobin A1C is very interesting. So again, there are probably two I think, competing hypotheses about that. One is that it's just about insulin resistance, the severity of insulin resistance reflecting the severity of heart failure. So if your heart failure gets worse, if it gets more severe, you become more insulin resistant. And of course, if you stop heart failure getting worse, stop people deteriorating, you stop an increase in insulin resistance, and that's why you have a lower hemoglobin A1C, that's why you need less insulin. So that's one theory. But there's a separate view that neprilysin inhibition has some metabolic effects of its own. So for example, neprilysin inhibition and an increase in natriuretic peptides seem to result in less adipocyte replication. So you have fewer adipocytes if you've got higher natriuretic peptide levels, and neprilysin may in other ways also influence adipocyte differentiation and replication. So there may be a direct effect on fat cells, there may be an indirect effect through insulin resistance, but there's a lot of speculation here. Now there's also a lot of people have already started to do new studies to try and understand this a bit better. There's also been some speculation about bradykinin, but I don't think that that's true. I mean, we know that bradykinin definitely enhances insulin sensitivity, but I don't believe that there's probably any major difference between sacubitril, valsartan and enalapril in relation to bradykinin. We didn't see much more edema. We actually saw less cough. So I don't think bradykinin could be an explanation, but that's probably the third possibility that's been brought up to explain it. Do you have any thoughts about it? Do you have any thoughts about it? No?
That's why I asked.
Dr. McMurray, from that anyway, can you just go through this?
Yeah.
Oh, go through.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Now I'm going to wish I hadn't done it. So this is just to remind you about natriuretic peptides. So when the cardiomyocyte is stressed, so for example if there's an increase in left ventricular end diastolic pressure, left ventricular wall stress, the cardiomyocyte secretes this hormone pro-BNP. So this is a large peptide, 108 amino acid peptides, and almost immediately on leaving the cell and entering the circulation, entering the blood, this large peptide is cleaved into two parts. NT-proBNP, which is an inactive, inert fragment, has no biological effect, and BNP, as we know, BNP, which is a 32 amino acid peptide. This is the physiologically active peptide. Now this is what's broken down by neprilysin. So if you inhibit neprilysin, you should increase BNP, but if you inhibit neprilysin, you should have no direct effect on NT-proBNP. NT-proBNP is not a substrate for neprilysin. It is not a physiological active hormone. So what happened in paradigm heart failure? This is what we saw, and this has puzzled a lot of people, including some of my best friends who think they're experts on hormonal systems and heart failure. So what we saw was a small increase in BNP. So the blue line is sacubitril valsartan, LCZ 696. This black line is enalapril, so small increase in BNP. But we saw a much more striking reduction in NT-proBNP with sacubitril valsartan. So why did these two natriuretic peptides go in different directions? And that's been, I think, a very puzzling thing for many people. And what I've tried to do is explain it using this cartoon. So if you look at the far left of the slide, as you look at it, the red bars what you see is before and after getting sacubitril valsartan. So sacubitril valsartan does good things if it's a vasodilator, as we believe it is, if it reduces left ventricular end diastolic pressure, if it reduces wall stress, you should see less pro-BNP secretion, and that should lead to a reduction in both NT-proBNP and a reduction in BNP. If you reduce wall stress, both of these peptides should decrease because you're having a favourable effect on left ventricular hemodynamics. But of course, if you inhibit neprilysin, then you will inhibit the breakdown of BNP, and because you inhibit the breakdown of BNP, BNP should go up. So the net effect, the overall effect in BNP, really reflects two opposing actions. The reduction in wall stress, the reduced secretion of pro-BNP, the precursor of BNP and NT-proBNP, but for BNP also this inhibition of its breakdown. So the NT-proBNP just reflects the indirect reduction in wall stress, reduction in pro-BNP secretion. The net level of BNP reflects these two opposing actions. Now, I don't know if that makes sense, but that's what we think is going on and why these two peptides move in different directions.
So which is more pronounced level elevation of this NT-proBNP or BNP? Is it in HFrEF or HFrEF? That's the first question. Second question is, we use occasionally guided therapy for our patients, so we cannot use BNP, so we use NT-proBNP as our guided therapy. And third is, if a patient is on sacubitril valsartan and they improve, can we step down our dose?
So I think I can hear the audience answering your last question, which is no, because I showed you what happens to people who have a dose reduction. They do worse. And that's true for beta blockers, it's true for ACE inhibitors, it's true for angiotensin receptor blockers. So I would not do that unless I absolutely had to. You asked me about elevation of natriuretic peptides in patients with HEF and HFrEF. Well, the levels are much higher in patients with HFrEF than in HFpEF, and we've seen that consistently. By the way, one thing I didn't explain is that CNP and ANP, so two other natriuretic peptides, are much better substrates for neprilysin than BNP. And again, unfortunately, we didn't measure ANP because it's very unstable, and if you're doing a multi-center global trial in 900 sites in 43 countries, you can't collect blood on dry ice and ship it immediately to a lab, but we're now doing some follow-up studies to look at these other peptides. That was your first, and your last one was already answered, and the middle question was, I've forgotten, what was it?
Guided therapy.
Guided therapy. Well, it's interesting that you do use guided therapy because, as you probably know, the results of the trials using guided therapy have been very mixed. And the largest and most recent trial, which was called GUIDED, it was a National Institutes of Health funded study in the United States. That study was stopped at the end of last year because of futility. There was no difference, and even if the study had continued, there would be no possibility of showing a difference. And if you look at the earlier natriuretic peptide guided studies, I think my interpretation of those studies is that what BNP or NT-proBNP measurement was really doing was encouraging doctors to use evidence-based doses of evidence-based treatments that they should have probably used anyway. And in the studies where the control group were very well treated with evidence-based therapy. There was no difference with using natriuretic peptides to guide treatment, but in the studies where the control group were not that well treated, then the BNP or NT-proBNP guided group did better, and that was largely because the peptides were being used to help doctors remember to increase the dose, help doctors remember to add another drug. So that's how I would interpret the studies, and that's fine. I mean, if you have if natriuretic peptide measurement helps you treat the patient with evidence-based therapy, that's fine by me, but I don't think you necessarily need to measure natriuretic peptides. In one of I showed you some NT-proBNP data from Paradigm. In that paper, which was published in JACC in January of this year, you can see that we also looked at reaching certain NT-proBNP thresholds, and you're absolutely right. If your NT-proBNP was below 1,000, you clearly did better than if it was above 1,000. And if you were in the sacubitril valsartan group, you're much more likely to be below 1,000 than if you were in the enalapril group. So it all kind of hangs together. But I don't think you need to do that. But if it helps, if it leads to improved treatment and leads to better outcome, then that's great for the patient.
I just would like to have a clarification of one of your slides, which mentions that 42 to 43% of those with enalapril and LZZ experienced dose reductions. I wonder if these were just transient dose reductions, because the figure I remember is that about 73% of patients finished with dose level 3. So can you explain the 42 to 43% dose reduction? Is it just transient, transitory?
So, Antonio, it was transient as well as permanent, and it was also discontinuation, so it was reduction including down to a dose of 0. So, so it was.
I was just wondering, is there a kind of a proportionate relationship of sacubitril and valsartan?
Yes.
So that if you have to increase your valsartan, you need to increase the sacubitril concentration as well?
So that's a very interesting question, because it goes way back into the history of how this trial got designed and done in the first place. So this molecule, which was called LCZ696 when we started using it, has sacubitril and a particular salt of valsartan bound together in a 1-to-1 ratio. And the only way that chemical can exist is if there is a 1-to-1 ratio. Now, this is not the normal valsartan that you or I could prescribe to our patients. The trade name would have been Diavan. That's a different type of valsartan. And if you, I don't know how the dosing is in the Philippines, but in my country, 200 milligrams of LCZ696 is 97 milligrams of sacubitril and 103 milligrams of valsartan. And that 103 milligrams gives you blood levels of valsartan equivalent to 160 milligrams of the conventional formulation of valsartan. So when we started the trial, one of the first things that we had to do was to be reassured that the 200 milligram dose of sacubitril valsartan gave us the equivalent blood level of 160 milligrams of valsartan, because ethically we could not have done this trial unless that was true. So to some extent, the dose of LCZ696 that we used was determined by the blood level of valsartan. We had to use a dose of LCZ696 that gave us a blood valsartan level the same as 160 milligrams of conventional valsartan. So then the next question we had, well, if that's the case, if that was the 200 milligram dose of LCZ696, how much necrolysin inhibition did we get with that? Because again, there was no point in doing the study if we weren't getting significant and sustained necrolysin inhibition. But fortunately, that 200 milligram tablet of LCZ696 gave us more than 90% necrolysin inhibition for about 12 hours. So it was perfect. It was a formulation that would give us sustained, significant necrolysin inhibition and allow us to dose the drug twice daily. So in many ways we're very fortunate, and also in many ways that's why we didn't do the traditional phase 2 type of study that most new drugs that are being developed in heart failure go through, and that's partly why we don't have echoes and things like that, because this was the only dose of this drug that we could use. So what was the point of doing a dose ranging study looking at left ventricular ejection fraction or whatever? And that was sort of part of the thinking that led us to go straight into doing a large mortality, morbidity trial. We had proof that the necrolysin inhibition was doing something more than just valsartan, because there had been a study done in hypertension showing that 200 milligrams of LCZ696 lowered blood pressure significantly more than 160 milligrams of valsartan. So that was proof that there was additional pharmacological action of necrolysin inhibition, and we decided, what more do you need? We knew the dose of valsartan, we knew that the necrolysin inhibition was doing something additional pharmacologically, and we knew that we would only be wasting time if we did phase 2 studies, because eventually, if you were ever going to use this drug in clinical practice, you were going to have to do a mortality, morbidity trial. So that's all wrapped up in the history of how the trial got done.
So that actually brings me to the second point. I know that, like before you use LCZ 696, if the patient is previously on ACE or A or B, you discontinue that, right?
Well, you switch.
You switch, yes. Okay. Now, what do you think about like a patient receiving A or B, for instance, valsartan, like 80 milligrams a day? Instead of discontinuing it, you just add LCZ 696, and you have like 100 in the morning, 100 in the evening. In other words, it's the valsartan therapy.
So again, I think I'm hearing somebody getting the answer. My concern about that would be that you're not maximizing necrolysin inhibition, and we do know that you get reasonably good necrolysin inhibition with the equivalent 100 milligrams twice daily of LCZ696, but if you go below that, then you're predominantly just getting the effect of valsartan and not getting very much necrolysin inhibition. So if you want to achieve what we believe are the benefits of necrolysin inhibition, then I think you have to try and get up to the equivalent of 200 milligrams twice daily, so in other words, of 97 milligrams twice daily of sacubitril. When you think it's hot down there, you ought to try standing in front of this.
Thank you for the lecture. First, can we use this in an acute decompensated heart failure patients, for example, when they come into the ER, congested? Number two, how long should the patient take this medicine? Is it for life? Or if the patient recovers, EF improves, can we start it or can we all throughout?
So the second question is an interesting one because we all have patients who show apparently complete recovery of their ejection fraction, and if they're young people they often ask you, do they have to continue to take these drugs? And generally I say yes, unless it's something very specific like a peripartum cardiomyopathy. If I'm really convinced the patient did have a viral myocarditis. But sometimes I have to say to the patient, okay, if you really insist on stopping, that's fine, but we want to keep a very close eye on you and we want to repeat your echocardiogram. And I have to say, I have many examples of people getting worse after stopping treatment and then they have to go back on treatment. So in general, I think all of these drugs, and not just sacubitril, valsartan, beta blockers, MRAs, are really for life, except in very specific circumstances. And if I withdraw treatment, I really do follow them up. In young women, I will sometimes be willing to stop a drug that blocks the renin-angiotensin system, and that would include sacubitril, valsartan, but keep them on a beta blocker because of issues like pregnancy and so on. But these are the rare individualized decisions. So for most people, it's a lifelong treatment. I've forgotten what your first question was. Oh, acute. Yes, that's interesting. So clearly that's not, we did not study people with acute decompensated heart failure, except of course, we had very many people who were admitted to hospital during the course of the trial with worsening heart failure, who of course continued on study drug. So it's not correct to say we've no experience of this drug in acute decompensated heart failure. We've actually quite a lot of experience of this drug in acute decompensated heart failure. But what I would say is that we've had this drug for getting on for 2 years now in the UK, so we've got quite a lot of experience with it. And we do use it in the acute setting as we got more comfortable, more familiar with it. We have done that. It's not in the guidelines, it's not the trial. But I could also point out that, for example, there's no trial that studied ACE inhibitors in patients in hospital, but we all now use ACE inhibitors in patients in hospital. And I think there are two ways you can use this in hospital, or at least two ways that I've used it. The first is that if you get somebody who has presented for the first time with decompensated heart failure, they've not been on an ACE inhibitor or an ARB before, they come in, they're edematous, they're congested, they're a really good patient to start treatment with sacubitril valsartan. Now this is all off-label and all the rest, but in my experience, these are very good people to start treatment in because they tend to have a higher blood pressure, they're volume overloaded, they tolerate the introduction of any neurohumoral modulating drug very well. And then the other time we do it is in patients who've maybe come in who've had a long-standing diagnosis of heart failure, decompensated, they come in, they've been treated acutely, and before they go home, we switch them from their, usually in our country it's an ACE inhibitor, to sacubitril valsartan before discharge. So those are the two sorts of scenarios that I do it in.
Ricky first. Thank you.
Yes, some of our heart failure patients have to be on nasogastric tube, and I'm under the impression because they're intubated and then or they have other problems locally. Now, some of them have gastrostomy tubes, so just the question is, you're not supposed to be destroying the tablet to deliver it. So there are no exceptions for the subset of delivery systems, right?
So I have to say, I have no idea what the answer to that question is.
Okay, and then just the second question is...
But if they have a gastrostomy...
Then they can be given whole.
Yeah.
But for those who don't have yet...
Well, I used to give captopril sublingually a long time ago. I don't know of any reason why it can't be crushed. Well, maybe there is a reason, but I don't know of one.
Okay.
But these must be very unusual.
Yes. My second question is, I think the patients in the paradigm are not all ischemic cardiomyopathy. And there are a hefty number of non-ischemic cardiomyopathic patients. So was there any difference in the rate of revascularization or investigation on follow-up? I mean, over time, while they're on LCZ 696? Because the question some doctors here are asking is, so when does it become the role of the physician to pose the question, well, over time, maybe we should consider revascularization as an option, and optimizing heart failure therapy might just be given or a basal condition. Was there any difference between?
So the answer is I don't know, but I can find out easily enough because I can look at the database. I don't think there were that many revascularizations during follow-up. I showed you the baseline data, but we did collect information on revascularization, so I could look it up. Oh, actually, I've just had a thought. I do know, because if I can find it, we did look at, I don't know if I've got revascularization separately, but we do have, can you, oh, sorry, it's not my computer and I can't use it, it's too hard. I think I might possibly have a slide that answers your question. Sorry about this. Here we are. I don't know if I've got it on this, but let's see. There you are, coronary revascularization. No difference, but very small numbers, very wide. We just did this. In fact, this is actually just being published online. I think last week. We did this because when we were planning the post-MI trial, the Paradise MI trial as it's called, we thought we would look at coronary events, but there were so few of them that it was difficult to see anything clear. But certainly if you put together this coronary composite endpoint here, this cardiovascular death, MI, hospitalization for unstable angina, other angina, and coronary revascularization, you do get the impression that there is a beneficial effect. But most of the events were cardiovascular death, so it's a little bit hard to say. But coronary revascularization, no difference. I remember it. Sorry.
Last two questions.
Put it down to lack of sleep.
We have to leave some questions for tomorrow. Yeah, one more.
Just two questions. I know you're still doing a lot of sub-studies, right? Is there an ongoing real-world trial? And number two, and number two would be like, would it be conjugated on a KT patient post-kidney transplant, ischemic cardiomyopathy with normal renal function?
Okay, so the first question, I don't know what you mean by a real-world trial. Oh, I'm sure Novartis are doing post-marketing surveillance, but that's not a trial. And this is a real-world trial. I mean, this had 8,400 patients from all around the world. There's no more real world than, I mean, every continent except Antarctica was involved in this trial. So. So I know your first question was a joke, but what was the what was the
Second one was a KT patient with ischemic cardiomyopathy.
so a patient with a renal transplant?
Yeah, but already a normal creatinine.
Uh-oh.
The
Why not?
The surgeon discontinued it because he commented that he doesn't want it. It's already 8 years post 80.
I can't think of any reason to do that. I mean, as you know, there are several studies done in the past showing that natriuretic peptides are good at preserving renal function in the immediate post-transplant patients. So that's one thing. Secondly, we saw, and I showed you, evidence that sacubitril valsartan is probably better for kidney function than enalapril. And I can't think of why you would not give it. There's no inherent danger unless there's some interaction. What anti-rejection drugs is additional?
He's probably afraid of that. He had no previous experience.
Yeah, might be that, but there's otherwise there's
The
no.
only thing I would probably think is increasing potassium levels at the time.
But we saw less hyperkalemia with sacubitril valsartan. So I don't understand why your friend said that.
Yeah, probably.
You can go back and find it.
Professor, that was a very elegant lecture, Professor. I have 2 points, Professor. My first question is, I would like to share my anecdote on this drug first. I have tried repeating the echo of all my patients, and 1 year later, all of them had ejection fraction above 50. One had 29 at the start. A year later, the ejection fraction was 50, and the LVEDD was a lot smaller. Although I have an analysis because of the very small pool that we have, but then that is just to share my anecdote with you. My question, sir, is this. Most of my patients who did better, and I'm happy with the outcome, did actually reach the paradigm recommendation of 200 milligrams. Yes. So most of them had 100, and in fact, sir, I had the opportunity to cascade paradigm to some doctors, and their most common concern was that they have this difficulty increasing the dose, climbing up the dose from 50, the start, to 100, because oftentimes they would claim, every time I do that, the blood pressure will drop. And your new slide with regards how worse they are will explain exactly why the blood pressure drops every time you try and scale up. So that will really be of benefit, especially to us of a scale paradigm to most of our colleagues. So my question, sir, is, if you are actually satisfied already with what I said, should you still aim for the 200? Especially knowing that Filipinos are not taller than me. I mean to say, we are not like our Caucasian counterparts who are like 100 kilos and above.
So, well, I'm not here to tell you how to treat your patients. I don't work here. You know far better than I do how to treat patients in this country. The only thing I would say is that bigger doses will give you more neprilysin inhibition, and this treatment is definitely working through neprilysin inhibition. What I've not talked about is that when I was doing this, I was doing another very large trial adding a renin inhibitor to enalapril, and we saw no benefit, we only saw more side effects. So this is not about intensification of the renin-angiotensin system blockade, this is about neprilysin inhibition, and I believe that the more neprilysin inhibition you get, the better. So I would always try and get a higher dose, but I understand what you're saying, and obviously I've been to this country before, I've been all around Asia, and I hear very similar points that you make, that doctors feel that their patients don't tolerate as high doses as patients do in the West, and doctors are concerned about hypotension much more than in other countries. I don't understand that one so much. I understand the size of people, I understand the dose. But, I mean, a low blood pressure by itself is not important. What matters is low perfusion. So if you're not perfusing your brain and you're dizzy or lightheaded, of course that matters. If you're not perfusing your kidneys and your kidney function get worse, then of course that matters.
But Professor, the patient came to me with a blood pressure of only 70. Wouldn't you be scared to be soothed?
I wouldn't be scared. Last week on Wednesday morning in my clinic, I saw a patient who walked in who was absolutely fine, who had a systolic blood pressure of about 81. And I can guarantee that if I sat that patient down on the couch and left them for 30 or 40 minutes, his systolic blood pressure would probably be about 70.
Exactly.
And that doesn't bother me because he feels fine and his kidneys are fine. So his organ perfusion is fine. So blood pressure itself isn't what matters. It's about blood flow, it's about organ perfusion. But anyway, your point in general is a good one. So we also do sometimes have problems up titrating sacubitril valsartan to 97, 103 or 200. And the tricks that we've learned are make sure that your patient isn't on other blood pressure lowering drugs that they don't need to be on. Nitrates, calcium channel blockers, in our country Nicorandil, and one or two other things. In men, the biggest problem we have are alpha blockers that are given for BPH. Our urologists are our worst enemy. And then diuretics. So if your patient is euvolemic, normal volemic, if they're not congested, then often we will prophylactically cut back on their diuretic. But you have to be careful because, again, I have seen people who then become more edematous. You can't just cut back on diuretics and forget about the patient. You do need to see them again, but we've done that. So using those measures, we've not had much of a problem, but you are right, our patients are bigger, taller, our weather is a lot colder. People are not vasodilated because of the temperature. So, as I say, you know much better than I do about treating people in the
Professor,
Philippines.
I did hear you say when you said all of these milligrams had their own benefits, the 50, the 100, and the 200 milligrams. But what I'd like to ask probably is, did you ever try to post hoc to see what is the p-value of the effect of 50?
I showed you that.
Oh, yeah.
So, but
Sorry,
we didn't have the 50, and I would be very surprised, truthfully, if the 50 did anything, because you get very little neprilysin inhibition with that. So with 100, you do get maybe 50% neprilysin inhibition as opposed to 90-something% neprilysin inhibition. With the 50, you get very little. So I think my rule of thumb would be if you can get above 50, if you can get at least to 100, you're probably doing something, and that's as far as you can ever say from a post hoc analysis. That's what those data that I showed earlier suggest. But I would still try and get to 200.
Yeah, with the 50, I think it's just a starting point where we basically start our patients. Sir, one of the most difficult questions I often get also when I give the cascade is when they ask me point blank, so are you saying that we should not use ACE inhibitor and go straight directly to sacubitril valsartan?
So the answer to that is that at least where I work in Europe and in North America, and I don't know if it's true of the Philippines, that's what the product labeling allows you to do. It's not what the guidelines recommend, at least in Europe. So that's the dilemma that most doctors have. So do you follow the guidelines or do you follow the product labeling? And the guidelines were appropriately cautious, and I do mean that. They were appropriately cautious because this was a new treatment. And guidelines are meant to reflect evidence based on trials, so the guidelines were faithfully following the Paradigm heart failure trial. The regulatory labelling is much more generous, much more liberal, and does allow you to start treatment directly. And Antonio's heard me say this before, but one of the reasons for that is that the first agency that we spoke to was the US Food and Drug Administration. And when we went there, their initial thoughts about labelling were that the labelling should reflect the Paradigm heart failure trial. But we had a conversation. I literally had a conversation with one of the lead FDA gentlemen, and it was along the lines of, okay, so to get into Paradigm heart failure, you had to be on an ACE inhibitor for a month, at least a month. You had to be on a dose equivalent to an Allopril 10 milligrams once a day to enter the run-in. So we could do that. So we could say in the labelling, you have to be on an ACE inhibitor for at least a month. You have to be on a dose equivalent to an Allopril 10 milligrams once a day. But then you could switch. And when we talked about it, we said, does it really make sense to check somebody's blood, creatinine, potassium, start them on an ACE inhibitor, up titrate the dose, and then after 1 month, start it all over again? And he said, no, that doesn't make sense. And then the other thing I said was, and if you look at the Paradigm data, we saw less hyperkalemia, we saw less renal dysfunction. Maybe if you started with sacubitril valsartan, you could get to a more intense level of renin-angiotensin system blockade if you started on sacubitril valsartan than if you started on an ACE inhibitor, and we believe that would be beneficial to the patient. So it was those two arguments that I believe persuaded the regulators that they should take a broader, more liberal view about this. And certainly, where I work, if we see somebody who's never been on a renin-angiotensin system blocker, then we would definitely start them with sacubitril valsartan first. It just makes no sense to us to start on an ACE inhibitor and then after a month have to go through the whole business all over again. Now that again is my perspective. Other people might have a different view, and again I recognise that doesn't reflect what the European guidelines say, but I've explained why I think the guidelines have to say what they do say.
Just one last point.
I thought there was a party.
No, actually, John, it's pretty obvious that not all patients can tolerate sacubitril valsartan because of blood pressure problems, and that's the reason why when we screened it, it was 95 systolic and above. And if you remember during the run-in, about 10% of patients couldn't tolerate dose level 3. Allow me to share you our experience in the Philippines. We had about 250 patients randomized in the Paradigm, and 93% of patients tolerated dose level 3. 93%, meaning 200 milligrams 2 times a day. And if you look at the global, it was only 88%. So that puts doubt whether BMI really matters when doing up titration.
Well, I didn't want to say that because it's kind of presumptuous of me to tell you about these things, but we were doing Paradigm, and at the same time we were doing Atmosphere, which was the aliskiren added to an Allopril trial. And when I went to China and went to Japan, I was told exactly what I've heard here, which is that small people, small BMI, don't tolerate big doses and all the rest. And actually, we didn't do Paradigm in Japan, but we did Atmosphere, the aliskiren trial in Japan, and the Japanese doctors begged us to have a separate protocol for Japan where there were lower doses, where we would use lower doses. And we said, look, we can't do that. You can't have an Allopril target dose 5 milligrams twice a day in Japan and 10 milligrams twice a day in the rest of the world. So eventually they agreed that they would do the trial. And the interesting thing is in Japan, we had a higher proportion of people reach the target dose, a higher proportion of people remained on the target dose, than in the rest of the world. So despite everything that they said would happen, we saw exactly the opposite. So I just don't know anymore. I wasn't going to say that, but you brought it up. But it's the truth that we did not see, we absolutely did not see this difference that everybody talks about. So,
brief comment from Rene. Good evening. Thank you, Professor. Just a comment in my experience. Each time I start them off with a 50 milligram, I would notice an increase, in fact, of their systolic pressure after a week or 2 weeks, which makes me confident in increasing the dose to about 100. In fact, I have more 200 milligram patients. I'm taking care of more patients on 200 milligrams than 100. And because of this observation, I am even comfortable in starting them with an 80 millimeters systolic pressure. But instead of a 50 milligram, I start them off with a half tablet of the 50. Again, it's off-label. But this is also what I see. You know, you ease them a bit, and then after a while, pressure starts to go up. And I agree, you take out the nitrates, you take out the loop diuretic if they don't need it anymore, you take out the CCB. In most cases, they do improve. And the improvement is actually dramatic, symptomatic.
So that's what I call the art of medicine as opposed to the science of medicine, because you have to, I mean, trials tell you only so much, and then you have to gain experience. I mean, hypotension is a real problem. It does happen. It's not everybody can tolerate full dose sacubitril valsartan. Certainly in Glasgow, I would say maybe 10 to 15% of our patients don't get to full dose. And by far the most common reason is symptomatic hypotension. Renal dysfunction isn't a problem, hyperkalemia is absolutely not a problem. The only problem we see anyway frequently is symptomatic hypotension, and that in a minority of people definitely stops us getting to the top dose. So it is real, but it's not particularly common, and I think actually the trial, despite all the criticisms of trials, probably largely reflects what we see in practice as well.
Okay. Sorry guys, I guess we have to end this, but well, on behalf of the group, Professor McMurray, thanks so much for sharing with us your wealth of knowledge. And we still have Professor McMurray lunchtime tomorrow if you're interested to ask more questions. Once again, Professor, thank you so much.